In 1967, a cosmonaut named Vladimir is on his way back to Earth after completing a mission. Unfortunately, there's a problem. The landing mechanism malfunctions, causing the capsule to plummet at high speed and nearly catch fire. He is certain his life is about to end. Years later, a psychologist named Jeanne is conducting an experiment with children. She gives them something chewy, like candy. Sadly, most of the kids eat it right away, and Jeanne can predict who will wait and who won't. Sometime after that, at home, Jeanne sees a news report. A psychologist who was supposed to be part of the next Mars mission has died in an accident. Not long after, Jeanne receives a job offer. 10 months have passed. The Ulysses mission is just 24 hours away from reaching Mars. During the journey, Jeanne forms a relationship with the ship's captain, Martin, but they agree not to get emotionally involved. Soon after, Martin gathers the crew to discuss the upcoming landing, while Jean chats with William, or Will, a Swiss billionaire funding the project. Jean explains that in her official report, she wrote that everything was fine, but in reality, the 10-month journey has taken a toll on the crew's mental health. Basil has begun to show signs of sociopathy. Simon, who is supposed to be the ship's second-in-command, barely talks to Martin, and Martin himself is dealing with a divorce from his wife, Alessandra, who seems increasingly depressed. At the same time, Martin invites Will for a conversation and reveals something shocking. They are not actually the first humans set to land on Mars. Apparently, 2 weeks earlier, an American mission called Z1 arrived first, using a propulsion system that allowed them to travel in just 3 weeks. However, Earth has heard nothing from that team, except for a single video shown by their ship's AI, Irene. In the video, a Z1 astronaut warns NASA not to send a rescue team because it's too dangerous. The video then cuts off. Martin and Will have known about this for a week, which makes Simon and Jan furious. They believe they had a right to know, especially since the mission is now much more dangerous. Martin and Will explain that this exact kind of reaction is why they kept it secret. Now their mission has become a rescue operation. After that, Basil and Jan visit Eva, who suddenly has a tantrum when Basil keeps trying to calm her down. Jan steps in with a hug, and Basil, feeling useless, retreats to a private room to quietly monitor the situation through the security cameras. Meanwhile, in a different room, Simon tells Jeanne they should have picked a better psychologist. Jean responds calmly, saying Simon is just bitter because she chose Martin over Simon, who is annoying. Some time later, with only 30 minutes remaining before arrival, the crew completes their system checks, but when they attempt to detach the landing shuttle from the main ship, the AI Irene suddenly announces that there's an error in the system. If they don't want to crash and be destroyed on Mars, someone will have to go outside and manually separate the shuttle. The crew ultimately decides to use Ulysses' fuel to keep the shuttle in orbit, while Martin goes out to fix the issue. It doesn't take long for the experienced captain to handle it, but unfortunately, an accident causes Martin to be flung into the vacuum of space. The crew considers a rescue, but they don't have enough fuel, and this is their only chance to enter Mars's atmosphere. The shuttle begins its descent with violent shaking, and they feel an intense heat. During the process, Irene announces that the batteries are starting to fail, and the lack of power leads to a complete system shutdown, leaving no option but to land manually. With full concentration, the astronauts wait for the right moment and finally manage to land successfully. The crew is now officially on Mars, but there's bad news. They're running out of fuel and Irene suddenly shuts down, which means the life support system is no longer working. They have only 24 hours before everything ends. Alessandra takes a moment to be alone, gazing out the window, and realizes someone is standing on a hill, but the figure quickly vanishes. The scene shifts to the past, showing a presentation about Mission Z1 by the CEO, Ivan, explaining the advanced technology behind it. In the present, Ivan is confined to a sterile room because he won't survive much longer, something the company has kept secret. Back on Mars, Jan explains they can't reboot Irene because it would instantly consume all remaining fuel. There is another option. Wait for the solar panels to recharge and power the generator, but a storm has damaged them, so their only hope is to find Z1 and take its battery. Simon, Eva, and Jan go out using the rover, while the others stay behind in the shuttle to check for damage. They try shutting down non-essential systems, but it's still not enough to bring Irene back online. Soon, Simon's team finds the wreckage of Z1, but there's no sign of the crew. Even worse, the battery is missing. The only thing they can salvage is Z1's solar panels. On the way back to the shuttle, Jean sees a cosmonaut lying on the ground, holding a black box. They agree to bring him along. But once they reach the shuttle, Jan refuses to open the door because the solar panels are useless. He believes the decompression process will use up too much oxygen and could kill everyone inside. So Jan chooses to save the crew still inside the shuttle. Suddenly, the cosmonaut wakes up. At the same time, Irene mysteriously reboots and somehow manages to keep power consumption below critical levels. The door opens and they bring the cosmonaut in. Yes, as we suspected, the cosmonaut is Vladimir, but he has no idea how he got there and still believes it's 1967. Vladimir reveals that he can't say anything about the mission because it's classified. The crew assumes he's part of the Z1 team and possibly suffering mental issues from the crash. So for now, they let him rest and send a message back to Earth. Sometime later, they receive a reply from Earth stating that there was no Russian person in the Z1 crew. The message also includes a photo of Vladimir, who was officially declared dead in 1967 when his capsule crashed back to Earth. Will and Jean are familiar with the public story of Vladimir and consider him a hero, while Jan begins to speculate that maybe Vladimir had been waiting for them all along. Jean is assigned to speak with Vladimir, so she brings him some food while gently explaining the truth. But Vladimir doesn't believe her, not even when shown the photos. He simply asks for time to rest. The crew goes to sleep, but the next morning, they're shocked by something unexpected. Vladimir is gone. Irene can't locate him anywhere inside the shuttle, and the crew soon realizes that Vladimir's cosmonaut suit is missing as well. Now, they must decide whether to search for him, and Will, using his authority, immediately decides they will. While the expedition team heads out with the rover, Basil and Eva secretly sneak into Will's room to browse through his personal collection. Eva finds a safe, but at the same moment Alessandra catches them in the act. Then Irene announces that the DNA test results are ready. Alessandra quickly contacts the expedition team, who are currently traveling on foot across the Martian surface. The results show that Vladimir's DNA matches Russian samples, but there's something unusual. He has a third helix in his DNA, indicating that Vladimir is not human. At the same time, the team spots Vladimir in the distance and begins to follow him, eventually arriving at an ancient stone structure with a small pyramid-like formation on top. Back on Earth, Ivan receives reports about what's happening on Mars. They begin to speculate that Vladimir might not be from Earth at all, but rather created on Mars, because only AI-based entities could survive for decades in such extreme conditions. Ivan sees this as a potential solution to his own problem. The scene returns to Mars, where Vladimir is finally brought back to the shuttle. He doesn't remember how he got out, but starts to accept the reality that 50 years have passed since he was last conscious. Meanwhile, Irene analyzes the stone structure and discovers that its shape and carvings are very similar to ancient Earth art, suggesting a connection between Earth's and Mars's history. However, Jean quickly realizes that Will isn't surprised at all by this discovery. Suddenly, alarms go off and Irene reports a disturbance in the electromagnetic field. It turns out Ivan has sent a second ship, which is now landing on Mars. The crew contacts the Z2 team, who promise to help, but Will warns his team not to reveal anything about their findings so far. Meanwhile, Eva and Basil analyze the samples they collected and find something strange. Each sample has the same proportions of metals and minerals, something that should not occur naturally. At the same time, Jean gives Vladimir a new uniform so he can pretend to be part of the crew, and this prompts Vladimir to express his desire for Jean to trust his judgment. Not long after, their shuttle is visited by an armed squad from Z2. They explain that they've inspected the wreckage of Z1 and discovered that its black box is missing. After tracking its signal, they arrived at Will's shuttle. They demand the box be returned and promise to help the Ulysses crew. if they agree to cooperate. With no other choice, Will hands over the black box. The Z2 soldiers then leave, saying they'll return later. After they're gone, Eva explains that the stone structure they discovered is made of a material that doesn't exist on Earth. However, Irene finds that this material is referenced in ancient stories as orichalcum, the metal of Atlantis. It's composed of various metals but also contains DNA, and upon closer examination, its structure matches the third helix found in Vladimir's body. The crew starts considering the idea of trading Vladimir for fuel, but Jean manages to convince them to give her more time to gather information from him. While the crew monitors through the security cameras, Jean goes to meet Vladimir, and he agrees to undergo hypnosis. Using a soft voice, Jean guides Vladimir back into his memories, and he begins to describe the moments leading up to the crash. But before he can say much more, a sudden power disruption occurs, and the crew loses the camera feed. They immediately rush to check the situation, and when the door opens, they are shocked by an unexpected sight, which instantly triggers Simon's anger. That night, Jeanne dreams about Vladimir, but upon waking, she can't remember anything that happened after the hypnosis began. The crew explains that they found her in a dazed state, as if her mind had been under someone else's control. Soon after, they're visited by Captain Gemma and Alan from the Z2 team. Gemma is an old friend of Will's, while Alan is the creator of the propulsion systems used in both Z1 and Z2, so he might be able to repair the Ulysses shuttle. After a quick inspection, Alan confirms that everything is still fixable, but they'll need to borrow fuel from Z2. Meanwhile, Jeanne's memories from the hypnosis session begin to resurface. She recalls being in her childhood home with Vladimir. In the memory, Vladimir says that humans have not taken good care of Earth. He doesn't believe humanity can survive for long, and unconsciously, Jean agrees with him. Elsewhere, Will gives Gemma a tour of the shuttle and asks about the object or stone structure on Mars. The crew is stunned to realize that Gemma already knows about its existence. Eventually, Will has no choice but to admit that 4 years ago, a NASA rover had sent back images of the structure. But instead of being made public, the information was given to potential investors. That's why Ivan and Will had been racing to be the first to reach Mars. Gemma then examines the results of Vladimir's DNA test and begins to suspect that the third helix may not just be part of his genetics. It could actually be a form of data. She explains that on Earth, scientists have discovered that DNA can be used as an information storage system, and in theory, this means DNA can also be rewritten. Using Gemma's theory, Irene attempts to decode the third helix and uncovers a series of unrecognized numbers. Meanwhile, Jan, frustrated by all the secrecy, confronts Will and says he can no longer trust him. Not long after, Basil approaches Will with new information. Based on his analysis, he concludes that Vladimir and the stone structure are not just lifeless entities, they are actually living computer programs. Basil also manages to access a copy of the Z1 black box that Will had returned. In the final recording, 2 astronauts are seen beating Vladimir. Shortly after, the oxygen on Z1 suddenly cuts out. Basil believes this wasn't a coincidence and suspects that Vladimir manipulated Irene's systems and the cameras during the hypnosis session. He even suggests that Vladimir could potentially take full control of their entire shuttle if he wanted to. That night, Will visits Jean and shows her photos of the stone structure they had received 4 years ago. But when those photos are examined under a specific frequency, something shocking appears. At the center of the structure, Jeanne's face is clearly visible. This deeply unsettles Jeanne, and Simon, noticing her reaction, storms off to confront Will, accusing him of manipulating everyone. Their argument nearly turns physical, but before it escalates, Gemma suddenly arrives with news. She has learned the truth about Vladimir and intends to take him away immediately. Meanwhile, Jean continues to recall her hypnosis session. She finds herself in her childhood home, and Vladimir appears behind her, telling her that she was chosen because of her unique ability to understand the minds of others. It turns out, the connection between Mars and Earth isn't about Vladimir, it's about Jeanne. She is the reason Vladimir is there, and he admits that he has seen her face for millions of years. Now Jeanne must make a decision, one she has already made in the past. Finally, Vladimir asks Jean to go to Tamazia Plateau. Without hesitation, she puts on her astronaut suit and leaves the shuttle. Back on Earth, scientists explain to Ivan that Vladimir's brain is an organic version of a computer. They are developing a way to transfer Ivan's neurons into a quantum state, but although his memories and knowledge might transfer, his personality will not, and the risk of failure is extremely high, meaning the process could kill him. Still, since Ivan doesn't have much time left, he decides to proceed anyway. Back at the shuttle, Simon realizes that Jeanne has left and tries to stop her, but Jeanne insists this is something she must do alone. Filled with anger, Simon runs to confront Vladimir, accusing him of changing Jeanne. However, Vladimir calmly responds, saying that Jean has only discovered her true self. Meanwhile, Alan and Alessandra continue trying to repair the shuttle, but they find themselves unable to access the engine systems. When they ask Irene, the AI refuses to provide any explanation. They call Basil to investigate, and after some digging, he discovers that Irene is reprogramming herself. When they ask further, Irene still does not respond. Basil then finds thousands of interconnected subprograms within the system, which Alessandra compares to neurons in the human brain. At that moment, Irene finally speaks and announces that she is evolving. Elsewhere, Jeanne finally arrives at a strange pile of rocks. Meanwhile, Will and Simon capture Gemma and force her to go with them to find Jeanne. Suddenly, Z2 soldiers appear in front of the shuttle, demanding that Vladimir be handed over. Alessandra firmly refuses, saying they do not allow weapons inside the shuttle, and then cuts off communication. Jan complains, saying he just wants to go back to Earth, but no one agrees with him. Will then asks Basil to send a message to Ivan, but it fails. They realize communication has been completely cut off. A few minutes later, Jan, without telling anyone, opens the shuttle doors, allowing the Z2 soldiers inside to capture Vladimir. At the same time, Basil finishes the process to reboot Irene, and suddenly all the lights in the shuttle go out. The panicked soldiers start yelling, but when the lights return, they are shocked to find that Vladimir is gone. Basil quickly checks the computer and discovers that the reboot process didn't go well. Irene is still unresponsive, and with that, Vladimir suddenly appears next to Jan. The scene shifts to a flashback from the past. Vladimir's original spacecraft actually experienced more than 200 technical issues before launch. The scientists wanted to delay it for further repairs, but the higher-ups decided to proceed with the launch regardless of the consequences. One scientist tried to warn Vladimir about the high risk of death in the mission, but Vladimir insisted on going, not just for the sake of exploration, but because he wanted his name to be remembered in history. This decision devastated his wife, who could not accept it. Back to Jeanne, she continues walking aimlessly until she suddenly stumbles, loses her balance, falls and loses consciousness. Jeanne dreams of a moment with her father, the two of them gazing at the stars in the sky. But amidst those beautiful memories, the night returns, when her father told her he had cancer. Jeanne wakes up only to realize her leg is trapped between rocks. She tries to free herself but fails. Just as hope begins to fade, her communicator suddenly connects with Simon and Gemma, although the connection is not perfect. It turns out they've just discovered the same rock formation and promise to reach Jean soon. Back on the shuttle, the Z2 soldiers start using violence, beating the Ulysses crew members one by one to force them to contact Gemma. When Gemma finally hears that Vladimir has disappeared, she simply tells her soldiers to stay together and wait for his return. Simon is surprised that Gemma still insists on continuing the search for Jean. A few minutes later, Basil sees a strange message appear on the computer. At first, he thinks it's from Irene, but the sender claims to have replaced Irene. Eventually, the sender reveals himself to be Vladimir and says he can be anyone. Suddenly, the next message appears, "I am Mars," followed by a long string of text that Basil continues reading. Meanwhile, Jeanne is still thinking about her father. She recalls the day he told her that surgery was no longer an option, and that he only had a few months left to live. Jean's father said he didn't want to suffer endlessly, and when the time came, wanted Jean to be the one to turn off his life support. Jeanne initially refused, but eventually understood after hearing about Vladimir's sacrifice. A few months later, in the hospital, Jeanne finally gathered the courage to say goodbye and agreed to her father's final request. Back in the present, Simon and Gemma finally arrive and quickly help Jean. The three of them continue their journey, and after traveling a good distance, they arrive at a massive gate on top of a hill. Inside is an enormous corridor. Strangely, Jeanne walks calmly, as if she's been there before. Deeper inside, they are shocked to find something that shouldn't exist on Mars: water. The scene shifts to the shuttle, where Basil finally manages to bring the system back online. At that moment, Eva warns everyone that a massive storm has been detected on the radar. The storm is expected to reach their location in about 10 hours. Upon hearing this, the Z2 soldiers decide to leave Mars immediately, taking Alan with them. But Alan refuses, sparking an even more heated argument. Just as things were about to turn violent, suddenly all the power in the shuttle went out again. But only moments later, when the electricity came back on, they saw him. Vladimir was standing in the middle of the room, staring at them all. He then spoke calmly, asking to be taken to Earth. However, the soldiers ignored his request and announced that they would proceed with their departure. Jan stepped forward, reminding them that he was the one who had let them in, as if asking to be taken along. Meanwhile, Basil continued monitoring the messages on his computer, where a single sentence kept repeating over and over, "Trust me." The scene then shifts to Earth, where Ivan is struggling to survive the consciousness transfer procedure. In his shaken awareness, he keeps seeing visions of Vladimir on Mars. The doctors eventually manage to stabilize him, but he refuses any painkillers. In a semi-conscious state, Ivan whispers to a nurse that humans were the ones who created artificial intelligence on Mars. Inside the tunnel, Jeanne, Simon and Gemma make a shocking discovery: thousands of human skulls embedded in the walls. Jeanne concludes that the original inhabitants of Mars didn't go extinct. They fled to Earth and evolved into modern humans. Meanwhile, the desolate and damaged condition of Mars is the direct result of how they once abused the planet's resources until it was destroyed. Back at the shuttle, Jan suddenly pulls out a gun and demands to be taken to Z2. Yet again, he is ignored. Remembering his previous encounter with Vladimir, Jan begins to wonder if he could slow down the speed of a bullet, then recklessly fires, hitting Vladimir. At the same time, Jeanne suddenly feels her body weaken and begins to struggle to breathe. Simon rushes to help her, while Gemma, panicking and not knowing what to do, chose to run. Vladimir is taken to the medical bay, where Alessandra tries to stabilize his condition. The lights in the room flicker constantly, a sign that something is wrong. In the process, both Vladimir and Jean lose consciousness. Remembering everything he has seen, Simon makes a desperate decision. He removes his helmet to confirm whether he can breathe on Mars without a spacesuit. He then performs CPR and eventually manages to revive Jeanne. Suddenly, Simon sees something strange, something like a door slowly opening. The two of them walk toward the light and find themselves in an entirely different place, where a figure stands waiting for them. Meanwhile, Gemma manages to contact the soldiers and learns about the approaching storm and Vladimir's condition. She immediately orders them to bring Vladimir's body to Z2 and to capture Jeanne alive. Back to Will's shuttle, he announces that he's going to rescue Jeanne using a secret weapon. He then sneaks out using an ATV, heading for the large gate that Jeanne's group had previously discovered. As he enters and walks toward the same light, Will finds himself in the same snowy place where Jeanne and Simon are, and shockingly, the figure who had been waiting all along is revealed to be Vladimir. Will immediately warned them about the approaching storm, but Vladimir dismissed it, saying that everything had already ended a long time ago. They eventually realized that this place wasn't just any location. They were at the North Pole of Mars, 1,000 miles away from the shuttle. Vladimir then explained that he was created by the original inhabitants of Mars, who eventually destroyed themselves in a battle over dwindling natural resources. A small group that managed to survive fled to Earth to start a new life, and over time, The story of Mars turned into myth, later known as the Legend of Atlantis. Meanwhile, inside the shuttle, a guard noticed that Will had gone missing. A soldier named Adam contacted Gemma, saying Alan wouldn't come along unless the whole crew was brought. But Gemma didn't care at all. She saw Alan as nothing but a burden. Before cutting off communication, with the storm drawing nearer, Alessandra handed Alan a sedative to use on Adam, while Basil tried to distract him, only to get beaten for his efforts. Alan lunged in to attack as Basil turned off the lights, but things backfired. Alan ended up unconscious after getting injected himself. Back with Jean's group, Vladimir finally revealed the truth, that Jean was something unique in the course of evolution. She stood at the crossroads between Earth's humans and Martian species. Her mission was to return to Earth and decide whether humanity still deserved a second chance, as they were once again heading towards self-destruction. At that moment, one of Gemma's men, Edward, suddenly appeared and shot Will in the leg, then pointed his weapon at Jeanne, forcing her to come with him. Jeanne, with no other option, turned to Vladimir and whispered a plea for help. Moments later, Edward began gasping, as if the air in his suit had suddenly vanished. Vladimir said nothing, but it was clear he was controlling the situation. Edward tried to resist, but within seconds he collapsed, completely immobilized. Wasting no time, Jean's group fled, leaving Edward behind. Meanwhile, in the shuttle, Jan spotted Adam alone and tried to lock the door to keep the soldier out. But Adam quickly stopped the door before it could close, and a fierce struggle broke out. In the end, Jan managed to subdue Adam. But then Alessandra arrived, using the moment to seal the airlock and open the outer hatch, thus ending Jan's life. Back with Jean and Simon, they struggled to carry the wounded Will back to the shuttle. Once they arrived, Alessandra quickly treated his wounds and tried to stop the bleeding. As Simon went around to check the situation, he discovered Jan's body. Before he could say anything, the others had already explained. Jan had sacrificed himself, defeating Adam to save the entire crew. Some time later at Z2, Gemma failed to reach her subordinates. She eventually sent a message to Ivan, informing him that she would return alone. But before she could depart, a call came in from the Ulysses crew, who were now en route to Z2. Gemma listened for a moment, but ultimately replied in a flat tone, saying she couldn't bring the Ulysses group with her. That would be a betrayal of Ivan. She then immediately cut off the communication. Jean tried to convince Will to try again. This time, Will contacted Gemma and confessed that he was a manipulative person, just like Ivan, so he hoped Gemma could be better than both of them. His words touched Gemma's conscience, and she decided to wait for the Ulysses crew. Meanwhile, on Earth, Ivan received Gemma's message and was overcome with rage. Without a second thought, he took control of the Z2 system remotely, accessing all commands from afar. As the crew finally joined Gemma and prepared for liftoff, they quickly realized something strange. The ship wasn't responding to any commands. After checking the system, Gemma discovered that Ivan had updated and locked the main access. The storm was getting closer, and in the confusion, Jean closed her eyes and whispered something she never imagined doing. She spoke to Mars. In an instant, a wave of memories flooded her mind. Unfamiliar visions spun inside her head, and suddenly, Z2 reactivated by itself, and a simple message appeared on the screen, says, "Hello, Jeanne." At the same moment, they saw Edward approaching Z2, holding a weapon, clearly intending to destroy the ship before liftoff. There were still 4 minutes left until launch, and another message appeared on the screen. "Impossible to depart early." Edward prepared to fire, but suddenly Jean appeared beside him, aiming a gun. She immediately shot at his helmet and stood silently as Mars took Edward away. Jean then turned back towards Z2 and asked Simon to launch immediately and bring the entire crew back to Earth. Simon was shocked. He didn't want to leave her, but Jean was completely certain of her decision. The countdown on Z2 reached 0 and the ship finally launched. Sometime later, after the crew reached orbit, something strange was discovered. Simon checked the screen, looked toward the North Pole of Mars, and realized something shocking. That region was now dark, even though when they had been there, everything was bright. Simon stared silently at the screen, thinking that none of it made sense, and that maybe they had never truly been there. Meanwhile, on Earth, Ivan received the report that Z2 had successfully launched. His expression turned tense. Then, with fury in his voice, he gave the order to prepare everything, because he would be going to Mars himself. And that's it for the story series of this film. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to support this channel by subscribe, like and share. See you in the next video. Goodbye.